They were not interested in fixing it. They were interested in throwing red meat to their constituency to create an illusion that this was a wasteful, expensive, corrupt organization. And they used words like that. They called it a viper's nest. They called it a group of criminals. They called them radical left-wingers with a specific social agenda. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I mean, USAID, for its flaws, is a very inexpensive operation. It's a pittance. And despite its warts and all, it does good work, and its partners do good work. It saves lives. I've been involved in that in many places.
Hello and welcome to episode 35 of On the Edge. You know, when we started this program, we had hoped not to be chasing the news, but rather providing you, the audience, with access to people who had particularly interesting voices or experiences or knowledge, and we will continue to be doing that. But with the new Trump administration coming in and with so much changing so rapidly and dramatically, we had a little rethink, and upon occasion, moving forward, when it's appropriate, we will indeed look into things that have happened recently and do deep dives into things that are happening behind the curtain. So it is appropriate that our guest on this program is Chris Hennemeyer. And he has been working around the world for decades and decades, oftentimes in very difficult circumstances, war zones and crisis events, but oftentimes in conjunction with USAID, the aid organization that was at the forefront of America's soft power. And that organization currently, as we go to air, has been frozen. It is apparently going to be dismantled by Elon Musk. And we discuss that very topic, but also where USAID did things right, where they did things wrong, how they were organized, how they have been projecting American foreign policy for a very long time. What does it mean moving forward? Chris, like me, was actually in the midst of retiring when this catastrophic war began. And with our shared affinity for Ukraine and our history here, we both decided to return. That, of course, benefits us because with most of his career behind him, and I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth, but perhaps it allows him to speak a little bit more candidly. One last thing I should mention is that we are both old hat at this, so we're kind of like two old war horses sitting around chewing the fat. But, you know, do keep in mind that one thing that has always been a constant through line and On the Edge is that this is as much a discussion as it is an interview. Regardless, and no matter what, it will stay the same. We hope that what we give to you is a way to look into things that are very complex and do it in a manner that is both very helpful, insightful, and maybe even a little enlightening. So, Chris, thanks for coming. You are a veteran of, the U.S. diplomatic corps and what have you. Tell us a little bit about your history and what brings you to Ukraine.
Veteran, that's another way of saying an old guy. You're right.
Yeah. Well, I don't
takes one
exclude
to know
myself
one.
from that. So,
no, pleasure to be here, Phil. Thanks for bringing me on. And I was actually a Foreign Service brat, as we called it. My dad was in the diplomatic corps, and so was born overseas in Germany and raised in various countries in Europe and Africa and so on. And the bug bit me, and I decided I needed to carve out a career overseas as well. Mm-hmm. And this was 40 years ago, and careers were few and far between then. I remember there was a book you could buy called International Jobs, and it essentially was about 75 pages that told you could join the UN, an oil company, or the CIA, and those were your options. I didn't go any of those directions. I wound up firing off a letter to several different NGOs, and mm-hmm. the one that responded quickest was Catholic Relief Services. It's actually last year was the biggest NGO in the world. With over $1 billion worth of mainly U.S. government revenue, mm-hmm. which is not standing them in good stead today, of course. But I spent 19 years with them in various countries, mainly in Africa. And then, as one does as a Washington, D.C. resident, which I am, hung out my consulting shingle and worked for lots of other organizations over the years. Again, Africa, Asia, and for a very brief time in Ukraine in 2015, I was sent to Kharkiv, where I worked with displaced people. Mm-hmm. And, liked the place, loved the city of Kharkiv. Really,
good city.
Great city. It was fond of my team, was impressed by how bright and kind of energetic Ukrainians were. But that was for 4 months, and when I left, I didn't sort of dream of returning to Ukraine or even think that it was an option. Went back and continued to do things in Africa and elsewhere, and then 2022, beginning of 2022, I was sort of putting in my papers to retire. Mm-hmm. Social Security was about to kick in. My girlfriend was claiming to be happy to have me around for a while. And then the Russians had to go and launch their full-scale invasion. And needless to say, I started thinking about the people I knew here, and I thought, gosh, I should really go there and offer my services in some shape or form. But it didn't seem like this was going to go over well with the girlfriend. So I kind of sat there for about 7 months obsessively watching Ukraine videos on my laptop until one day she stalked into the dining room and stared at me and then said, just go to Ukraine. And so I bought a ticket to Kyiv, and sort of a circuitous path took me down to Odessa. Mm-hmm. And that was at the end of 2022. And so since then, I've spent about 5-6 months each year here in Ukraine doing a variety of things. Both volunteering for little Ukrainian humanitarian organizations that, again, are full of enthusiasm and energy, but didn't know much about what they were trying to do. And while my enthusiasm and energy may be a little less than theirs, I had, abundant experience to call upon and
contacts.
Exactly.
You know how things get done.
How things work and how to raise money and how to raise your profile. And so I did that for quite a while. And then one night I was lying in bed in Odessa. It was, I guess, the late 2023. Power was out. I think I had a beanie on and a sweater as I lay under my covers. And I thought to myself, God, if I'm cold, what is it like for a guy sitting out in the trench in Donbass or something like that? So next morning I grabbed my laptop, wrote an email to friends and family and said, can we raise some money to keep the guys warm, essentially? And in about 24 hours, I had about $8,000. And so I raced out and bought a bunch of stuff and then started making contacts with people who had a cousin in a unit in Kherson or in Mykolaiv or whatever. And one thing led to another. And so I started this very small, modest, focused one-man charity, which I call In the Trenches Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so just been raising money, going back to the States, rattling my tin cup, trying to do a bit of advocacy on part of Ukraine because I live in Washington. So, for example, was it April of last year when the big supplemental bill for funding Ukraine was floating or was stuck in the mud
Right.
in Congress? There were a lot of people knocking on doors in Capitol Hill. I was one of them. I went and saw every single Republican congressman, I think whatever that was, 214 or something, and handed them a little handout about why we should care about Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I take no credit for that bill eventually making it through the system, but it felt good to, to speak my piece to people who.
Well, when they finally got around to passing,
when they finally got around many Ukrainian lives later.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I do.
So now you're here based in Odessa and
in Odessa, buying tires and echo flows and drones and first aid kits and whatever it is these units that I now know pretty well need, and then delivering them with Ukrainian friends of mine who are very much plugged into that world.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, obviously we'll put the links to the to your aid group and try and raise some money. I think that's the most important thing we can do. But so you've had a long career, and as you say, you were ready to retire. I was going to do the same thing in terms of media. I've been a foreign correspondent for most of my career since I was in my mid-20s. I'm well past my mid-20s now. I've seen USAID in particular, because I know there's this controversy about what's going to happen with USAID. And I've seen the mismanagement. I've seen problems with communication between different organs of American power, whether that's USAID talking to state or state talking to the Pentagon or the Pentagon talking to the White House, or, there's a lot of moving parts that go on. From your perspective from the inside, what's your take on what is happening with USAID?
So I'd ask a hypothetical question first. Sure. Is USAID perfect? Does it need fixing? Yes, it does. I've been saying as much for 25 years. I've written op-eds about it. I've talked about it in the organizations for which I've worked, many of which received large amounts of USAID money. It's an overextended organization is a kind way of saying it. Another way of saying it is bloated at times. It is not always super efficient. But guess what? It's a federal bureaucracy. There is a certain amount of bloat and inefficiency built into any federal bureaucracy in any country, for that matter. It's the price we pay. Could it have been fixed? Yes. They could have called in 20 people like me and said, what would you do to make USAID a better organization? And we would have ideas galore. But they were not interested in fixing it. They were interested in throwing red meat to their constituency to create an illusion that this was a wasteful, expensive, corrupt organization. And they used words like that. They called it a viper's nest. They called it a group of criminals. They called them radical left-wingers with a specific social agenda. Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I mean, USAID, for its flaws, is a very inexpensive operation. The numbers bounce to between a little less than 1% of federal spending per year to a little more than 1%, but it's a pittance. And despite its warts and all, it does good work, and its partners do good work. It saves lives. I've been involved in that in many places. Most recently,
I've seen it.
Yeah,
I've seen it.
Sure
I've borne witness to it. I mean, as a journalist working in anywhere from North Africa to Central Asia to the Middle East to the former Soviet Union, that USAID symbol is, that's recognizable everywhere you go.
It's recognizable. It represents something about America that says we're not just a great country, but we can also be a good country. And I think that's, if we lose that, we lose something very important about the American brand. I was saying this to somebody the other day. There are a handful of countries that have a global brand. We call it, the shining city on the hill, the leader of the free world. We're very unabashed about how great and wonderful we are, sometimes to the nausea of the rest of the world. But we created some pretty impressive things. The world's oldest continuously functioning democracy, a constitution that has inspired people all over the world, and a foreign aid system that has been generous, that constitutes about 40% of the world's foreign aid, comes right out of the United States, and that wins hearts and minds. It influences people. It projects soft power. So if we've got, some cost overruns here or a poorly conceived project there, that's the price we pay for having decided that we're going to be more than just a big power that throws its weight around.
Well, that's right. And I mean, aside from what everybody thinks about, the kind of like crisis aid, the tents and food and, medicine, what have you, inoculations, all of those kind of things that USAID. There's also that American aspect that you speak of where, you're supporting free and fair elections and monitoring efforts, civil society movements like journalist unions and things like that. So, of course, autocratic systems are going to loathe that, see that as a threat, and moreover, see it as American cultural imperialism. I heard that all the time when I lived in Russia in particular. And I've heard that, repeated all over the place. But so those who criticize the USAID as being like part and parcel of U.S. foreign policy, well, in some ways it is. We're doing that awful thing of supporting liberal democracy.
And it's supposed to be. If you look at the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which JFK championed, it speaks of foreign assistance as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. So if anybody tells you this was only altruistic, they're not reading the law. It is supposed to be of benefit to the United States people and the United States government. Fine, we accept that. But unfortunately, the nincompoops that Trump has put in charge of gutting USAID either don't know or don't care about any of this. They don't care that USAID is fighting cassava blight in West Africa, where the most commonly consumed crop is being saved by organizations funded by USAID, or that USAID has funded anti-corruption outfits that are trying to keep local governments on the straight and narrow, or that USAID is funding child survival programs to make sure that infant mortality rates drop in many of the developing. These are big, big things that pay big dividends for humanity in general. But no, this is as we talked about before we turned on the mics. This is political theater. Yeah, it's ignorant political theater, and it appeals to people who know nothing about this topic, unfortunately.
Yeah, and coming from there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of cynicism when it comes to programs like USAID, and coming from a media place, there's a lot of skepticism about what I have done professionally in my life, reporting the news. But these are things that, an autocratic system or indeed the Trump administration as a whole as well, in that they don't like that. No. They want to cast aspersions. They want to tear it down and make sure that there isn't faith in those institutions. And it's an easy target
because there's not much of a constituency for these kinds of things, let's face it. Although that's changing. I mean, a certain part of USAID relies upon U.S. food aid, which is grown by farmers in the heartlands of America. Yes. Many farmers have supporting Trump or the Republican Party. So I think there will be some walk back on some of this stuff. But the other reason why why this appeals to a certain constituency within the United States, the destruction of USAID appeals to them, is that people labor under this illusion that it is this incredibly expensive thing, that there's vast sums of money. Polls will show that people believe that somewhere between 10 and 20% of our federal budget goes to these ungrateful foreigners overseas in the form of aid. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, it's, as we said, it's a pittance. It's less than 1% in many years. So, but facts apparently don't really matter in this case. This is all about, creating confusion and chaos and getting people worked up and then moving on to the next, China vase to break.
Yeah, one of the things that really bothers me about it, however, and I wonder if you feel the same way, one of the things that really sticks in my craw about it is this assumption that this is kind of these people who are out there doing USAID or indeed media are these self-indulgent kind of corrupt. I've lost people. Yeah, I've lost friends. Yeah, covering wars, trying to deliver information to an audience, primarily an American audience, but an English-speaking audience, who are dedicated to, this idea of, trying to deliver as best you can the news. And I know lots of people who worked at USAID who were very dedicated, very earnest, very sincere people trying to do the best they can in a system that is, as you admit, kind of bloated and problematic. That pisses me off. It really pisses me off. That's the one thing I really don't waver on is that these people are trying to do the best they can, and you're shitting on them from a position of safety and comfort. And you don't know what it's like out here, and you don't know what it's like inside these organizations. What is your kind of take on that perspective that these guys?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, look, I recognize I live in a little bit of a bubble, right? I live in Washington, D.C. Many of my friends are in the foreign aid sector, and many of them have worked for USAID or have received funding from USAID. So, I don't want to pretend that I'm utterly objective about this thing, but my girlfriend works for USAID. She's a immensely dedicated, talented, hardworking person. I mean, she puts in 60 hours, 70 hours a week, makes a very modest salary. For most of her career has been a contractor with no benefits, no pension, no big buyouts, and so on. So the notion that somebody like her could be called a criminal and a saboteur and somebody working against American interests, it's nauseating. It's false. It's duplicitous. It's intentionally wrong, and it infuriates me.
Well, and it speaks to this thing that I think has been pushed in no small measure by the Kremlin of the propaganda, the disinformation campaign, that the deep state. This is a part of the deep state, and media is part of. They're all in there working against your best interests. You're being lied to. This is all bad, bad, bad. And I mean, like when the USAID initially, or at least at one point, was being, ripped up by the roots there, where they planted this idea that Angelina Jolie came here for $20 million and stuff. Right. And those of us who have been monitoring Russian propaganda and disinformation went immediately to it, because what they do, and I'd like to get your input on this in the propaganda war, is that they will take like an account or a some sort of program that is given or is granted X amount of money, and then they'll say, well, it's this subsection of that's getting all the $20 million, when in fact, I mean, those of us who know, again, how the sausage is made, that's not how appropriations are done. Right. When I worked for VOA for a very brief period of time as bureau chief in Islamabad and Kabul in a different lifetime, I had to go through those training courses where they train you how to, put out bids and, how to get money appropriated and stuff. What I guess I'm asking is, again, from a perspective of knowledge and experience, that's not how it works. And yet the Russian propaganda feeds right into this deep state kind of nefarious stuff.
It's an old tactic. If you want to destroy something, you first begin by discrediting it. Little by little, you nibble away at the credibility of a particular thing that you have in your sights. And then you do, and I'm a little hesitant to use this analogy because unlike some people, I don't believe that our current administration is some kind of latter-day Third Reich, far from it. But I do believe that they've adopted what Goebbels used to call the big lie approach. Find a lie, repeat it often enough, and eventually it starts becoming believed by many, many people. There's no doubt in my mind that Musk has decided that this is a good tactic to use on any of the targets that he's got in his sights. So, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's absurd because if you look at the money that the U.S. government gives to organizations like USAid or others, indeed, that carry out foreign aid programs, because USAID is not the only one in the federal government that does so, no money is as closely monitored, as closely accounted for. I mean, for us on the, who are actually carrying out activities, it's often frustrating just how much, transparency and accountability is imposed upon us, almost all of which was dictated by Congress, by the way, not by any individual bureaucrats within USAID. So, that you could take a few $1 million and give them to Ben Stiller to come visit Ukraine, which is one of the latest ridiculous myths that Musk's people have put out there. It flies in the face of reality. That's not how it works. Yeah.
Jinx.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. And it drives me absolute distraction. But on another branch of this also is that, look, the United States projects power in two primary ways. One through the State Department, of which USAID is an organ, and one is through the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Okay? It's soft power or it's bombs.
Yep.
That's how we do it. Are you concerned that we are moving away from our soft power position and that leaves us with only one tool in the toolbox, and that's bombs?
So I'd actually add one more thing to that toolbox. We used to have, and you know this well as a journalist, we used to have a thing called USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, which ran libraries and cultural centers and what we called America houses in many countries in the world. And that had as its role to promote sort of traditional American culture. You'd go into a library and you'd learn about John Steinbeck or Ernest Hemingway, or you'd watch a movie, or they'd bring a jazz band in from the States. Exactly. And that was also a powerful tool.
But also our civil society as well. Sorry to interrupt you there. But also they teach you things about what is the Bill of Rights, what is the Constitution.
Exactly right. And
what is the court system? What is this? What is that?
That was a noble operation, and it was a victim of one of the last great efforts to kill foreign assistance that was led by Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, 25 years ago or something. And it turned out to be the organization that was sacrificed by Congress in order to save USAID. One of them was going to go, and it turned out to be USIA. So now our cultural impact on the world is no longer democracy or Steinbeck or, Louis Armstrong. It's whatever TikTok or YouTube decide to show to the world as American culture, which I would argue is probably a less noble form of culture. So now we're left with bombs or potentially with foreign aid. If we lose foreign aid, then we become no different than any other sort of empire, if you will. Yeah. It's all stick and no carrot. And people are not stupid. They will recognize that, and they will view America as a lesser thing than we claim to be. I mean, when you set your sights as high as the United States has since its inception, and if you claim you're kind of the cradle of democracy and this bright shining light in a dark, dangerous world, you have an obligation to live up to that, or at least to try to live up to that. We recognize that we've done terrible things. Our country has done terrible things. I mean, we've, exterminated our native peoples. We, embraced plantation slavery. We've assassinated foreign leaders.
Instigated coups.
But we've also done some really, really great things and some really noble things. And so we're forgiven for a lot of our crimes because of this higher idealism we have as a country. And I fear that this current crew in Washington doesn't have an idealistic bone in their bodies. It's all about power politics.
Yeah. Well, and it changes what we have been so often, well, certainly through the 20th century, defeating Hitler's Germany, freeing countless thousands from Moscow's oppression and winning the Cold War and all the rest of it, that we're in our greater best interest.
Yep.
Now it seems to me what they are trying to move towards, and I'd like your input on this, is a much more quid pro quo transactional thing. We will provide you, if you get flooded in Pakistan, we will provide you with tents, we will provide you with food, but we're going to want you to do something in the frontier. We want a transactional something in return. And that's not how we've done our foreign policy, our soft power in the past, but it does seem to be that's the direction they want to take it.
It's clear that, operating by transaction is the preference of Trump. I think there's another part that we should be concerned about too, and that is the potential for sort of carving up the world into zones of interest. So we might, in fact, not respond to a disaster in Pakistan. We might say, that's China's job. That's in their sphere of influence. We're only going to deal with things in our own backyard. And there again, I think that would be a tremendous loss for the world in general and for the United States in particular. But, if you ask me to predict what becomes of U.S. foreign aid, foreign assistance programs, I don't think it'll disappear altogether. I think what we will see is, and I certainly hope this is true, a return to much more emphasis on humanitarian aid. So in this sector, we make a distinction between humanitarian aid, life-saving, emergency aid, and what's called developmental aid, long-term stuff to try and develop the political systems of a country, promote the economy of a country, build civil society, and so on. This is difficult, messy, long-term stuff, and sometimes it works out well, and sometimes it doesn't work out well at all.
And you get returns that cannot be quantified. It's
very
difficult to
super hard to measure it. Yeah. So I think it goes without saying that if there is a giant earthquake somewhere or a horrible genocide or something like that, we probably roll up our sleeves and mobilize money and manpower to deal with it. But we'll get rid of a lot of these developmental programs. And where we have them, we'll probably only keep them in a handful of countries that we consider strategic. Again, coming back to this transactional approach. Rather than working in whatever it is, I think there's something like almost 100 countries where USAID has a footprint of some sort, either a physical presence or working through partners or whatever. That might be cut down to 20 countries that we consider to be strategic for one reason or another. It's, on the Horn of Africa, and that's a critical area we want to keep an eye on. Or it's in a place like the Congo where there are, abundant mineral resources or something like that. And the rest will be kind of left to their own devices. There are people who would argue that maybe that's not such a bad thing, that maybe it's time for countries that have received foreign aid for 2-3 generations to, look to their own house and ask themselves tough questions about why things are so dysfunctional. But there's a price to be paid for not being involved, and that price can be measured in actual lives.
Yeah, and you're also look, and nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
Somebody else will come in and do that, whether it's the Russians or the Chinese, or maybe a regional power. It's My concern, and I don't know if you want to respond to this or not, is that it does have us stepping back, less engagement with things that, as we've already discussed, they yield a benefit that can't be measured. And having seen it around the globe, I mean, I want to know, where is it going to be? The people who are on the streets of Rustaveli this week, for example, in Georgia, in Tbilisi, these are people who are fighting for civil society, fighting for the rule of law, fighting for democracy, standing up in the cold, on the streets, in the wet. And, a whole part of Moscow's intent there is to discredit USAid there as, foreign agents. Here in Ukraine, we're well past that, of course, because Ukraine has decided to go that direction itself. But what are your concerns as we step away from the global perspective of this? What does it mean to Ukraine? What will it mean to Ukraine if indeed USAID, programs are withdrawn from here? What do you think it's going to mean for this country?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, if we don't view Ukraine or Georgia, for example, as strategic, then we're really missing the plot.
I have concerns.
And rightfully so. Specifically in Ukraine, I can answer that a little bit because I have friends who work in this sector in Ukraine, and I've been talking to them over the last week. One organization, which will go unnamed, runs a very important medical program in this country, and they are unable, despite all the stuff coming out of Marco Rubio's office, that life-saving assistance is not touched by these curbs that the White House has put on USAID. Despite that, they don't feel comfortable going out and buying medicines, medical equipment, sometimes things, life-saving things like tourniquets, chest seals, and so on for people who have been wounded by Russian attacks on frontline communities, simply because they can't draw down on their U.S. government letters of credit that fund these things. I mean, it sounds like a very bureaucratic obstacle, but the problem is, it's one thing to say, it's okay, continue your life-saving activities. But if you don't understand how the system works, then your implementing partners, these NGOs and others, aren't willing to take the risk to spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of their own money in the vague hope that maybe somebody in the administration will eventually compensate them and reimburse them. There's another organization I was talking to the other day that does testing and treatment of HIV/AIDS. There are people who will not be getting their medicines if things continue, and they will die unpleasantly. There's a big organization. It's actually a contractor. It's not a non-governmental organization, but as we know, a lot of U.S. government foreign aid goes through contractors, which has been working on rebuilding Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has been, as you know, decimated by Russian attacks. That stuff is stuck in the water now. It's not moving anywhere. I mean, so this is real stuff, and it's in a country that it'd be impossible to argue this is not a strategic country for U.S. interests, no matter how you measure those interests, politically, economically, militarily.
Yeah.
So if we're going to let Ukraine hang out there in the wind, how much worse is it going to be if you live in the Central African Republic or Mali or Myanmar or
where Russians are? I mean, both the CAR and Mali, we see Russian power moving
successors of Wagner are in there. Yeah,
sure are.
Looting gold and diamonds and
Well, and when it comes to, it's interesting you point that out because again, people have this perception that has been pushed by the kind of Trump administration and the MAGA movement, that USAID is out there just willy-nilly throwing money out into the air, and anybody who wants it can get it. Where actually, it's been our experience here in Ukraine, speaking to Ukrainians, that actually a lot of people don't go for grants because it is an incredibly lengthy, meticulous program that requires them to meet certain benchmarks. And, it's not as easy as one would think. And the whole argument of like corruption absorbing this money doesn't take into account that a lot of Ukrainians are actually reluctant to do it because it's so difficult, and it requires corruption measures. You have to meet, you can't be corrupt and putting money in your back pocket, or you're not going to get that grant. How do we push back? How do we get that messaging out to Americans that it's not some sort of slush fund that's like cascading wealth on anybody who wants a buck?
No, it's anything but. I mean, even for the most experienced and competent American organizations that are recipients for USAID money, it is incredibly hard to get this money. You have to jump through a million hoops. You have to demonstrate a deep bench in areas, in back office functions like accounting and compliance and so on. And
checks. There are programs of checks
kinds.
You're going to have to show us your books after
absolutely
6 months, and you have to account. You're audited.
Yep. There are monthly reports, there are quarterly reports. It requires an army of people, an army of bean counters to keep tabs on the money that USAID gives you. So it's incredibly hard for local organizations, whether in Ukraine or anywhere else. And this is one of the things I've been very critical about the foreign aid organizations, and not just USAID, but the United Nations and other bilaterals who in a country like Ukraine with, a corruption, absolutely, but almost every place foreign assistance functions has some level of corruption. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're not perfect places, but it's incredibly difficult for Ukrainian organizations to get their hands on this money, despite the fact that there's been a pledge by USAID for, must be coming on 15 years now, to move, I think the target was like 20 or 25% of their money through local organizations, understanding local organizations are less expensive. They understand what's happening on the ground better than foreign organizations. They speak the language. They understand the dynamics, that this is a way of getting a better bang for your buck. If you can't do it in a country like Ukraine with as many smart, well-educated people, where can you,
if you're concerned about corruption in Ukraine, then spending money on anti-corruption efforts within Ukraine is a good use of taxpayer money.
Thank you.
Is my opinion.
Anti-corruption campaigns,
which I have been an eyewitness to here in Ukraine. There is a massive anti-corruption campaign going on, supported by, in no small part, U.S. soft power.
Yep.
So I don't get. I literally, I know as a fellow American, I've been over here too long, but I don't know how it is so hard to get that messaging through to the electorate that this isn't a waste of money, that for all of its faults, this is a good thing to be doing. And, I've got a buddy we interviewed here earlier on the show who runs a suicide prevention hotline that's paid for by, in part, or in the past at least, USAID money. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I'm okay with helping people in need because it benefits them, it benefits us. And I'm very frustrated with the way it's going. Are you optimistic that this will be stopped, or can we transition to another form of soft power that you've already outlined there? You think it won't be, that it'll be more reactionary to kind of events on the ground as opposed to long-term development.
Right.
But what do you think the future is for U.S. soft power?
I'm not super optimistic. I think as there will be some form of foreign assistance, as I said, it'll be trimmed way back. It'll be much less impactful in many places. It'll be absent in other places. I'm not sure whether we can change that dynamic by addressing the American people because, as I said, it's not a service that the U.S. provides that has an enormous amount of public support simply because there's just not much knowledge of it. But there has always been a very strong bipartisan consensus in Congress that foreign aid is a good thing, anything we should support. And both sides of the aisle have agreed on that for decades. And So what's really startling to me and depressing in a way is that how many Republican Congress people who have previously supported foreign assistance programs and USAID and spoken in support of those kinds of things are silent.
Yeah.
The level of political cowardice is stunning, and one wonders why. I mean, the Senate, for example, has long been known as the Millionaires Club. The reason is many of the people sitting in the Senate have very deep pockets. They're wealthy people. What do they fear? Is the end of their political career so important that they're not willing to take a stand on something as critical as continuing American influence through foreign assistance? It beggars belief for me.
What do you think happens if it really is curtailed? I mean, and what does that look on the global stage for Americans, but also, for the globe?
Well, I think it'll just leave a lot of people in the lurch because I'm not convinced that the humanitarian piece, the foreign assistance piece, will in fact be taken up by other players. I don't think the Chinese are going to come in and replace the United States. The Chinese have always operated in a very transactional way in the developing world. They'll go in and build a highway. They'll go in and build a new football stadium. They'll go in and build a new presidential palace for the local dictator, in return for which they will have access to minerals, to trading arrangements, and so on. But for them to go in and run a 20-year-long child mortality program or to promote anti-corruption or a free press, that'll never happen, nor will the Russians. There will certainly be attempts by European nations to try and fill in some of the gaps that the United States has left, but that will stretch them because the kind of political culture we're living through in the United States is not restricted to the U.S. These battles over political correctness, culture wars, immigration, et cetera, are raging throughout the Western world, maybe not as aggressively as in the States. But you see the same conversations happening in Germany and France and Denmark and so on. And so I think it would be very difficult for European countries, for example, to beef up their foreign assistance budgets to compensate for the absence of the United States. And that'll simply mean that some people will die who would not have died. Girls will not get an education that they might have gotten. Somebody will not get their medicines. A reforestation program will be discontinued. A newspaper that was providing valuable information to people on the front lines of Ukraine will disappear. I mean, that will be a real price to pay.
Do you have a feeling that there's the potential for a backlash, some resentment towards the U.S. withdrawing from the international community in this way?
I've got a baseball cap with one of those half Ukrainian, half U.S. flag decals on it. I took it off the other day because I felt embarrassed to wear that in Ukraine. I never have felt that way before, and it's sad to me that I didn't feel proud to have the U.S. flag on my hat. But I think there will be a backlash. Some places I think have kind of sensed which way the wind is blowing. Ukrainians are not naive. They've lived through 3 years of war and 3 years of a fairly wishy-washy support from the United States and other Western powers. And so I don't think this comes as a huge surprise to them. But it will no longer it will be hard to hold your head up as an American in a lot of countries where we were viewed as flawed, but basically the good guys. That won't be our image anymore.
No, I don't think it will. Look, as we kind of round down here, if I ask you to kind of put on that different hat, it doesn't have to be the one with the flag on it, but let's put on a different hat. And in your interactions here on the ground in Ukraine, what is what have you been hearing from your Ukrainian associates and people that you work with the Trump administration coming in and all these kind of like it? Because it looks like he's kind of pulling back support for Ukraine. Not just in terms of USAID, but what are Ukrainians that you're talking to saying about what America's doing under Trump?
Well, I mean, you know this better than I do. Ukraine is no more homogenous than any other country, and there are lots of different viewpoints.
It's a plurality. It's democracy.
Absolutely. And
flawed, but it's a democracy.
I was talking to a friend yesterday, and I said, what do you think about the proposition that, so for example, the lines of conflict be frozen, that an international force patrol that border, that Ukraine give up its claim to Crimea and parts of the Donbass and so on in return for some tenuous peace over some period of time? Is this something that you think you and other Ukrainians could live with? And her response was, look, people in my bubble, she used that term bubble, urbanites, well-educated and patriotic and so on.
This is a Odessite or
actually a Kyiv person.
Kievan.
Yeah. This is anathema to us, what you're laying out here and what the Trump administration is floating. We do not want this at all. I talked to another friend who is somebody who could very soon be conscripted by the army here. And his response was, look, the sooner this war ends, the better for me personally. And there are a lot of young men like that out there. I've talked to people in small villages. I was up in Kramatorsk in December and visited some villages out there. People there, I mean, there was just a weariness and a desire for the war to end. And, we'll see what the consequences of that are. So it's hard to give a clear answer to you because I think it depends very much on where you sit in this country. And we see this in public opinion surveys too. I mean, I remember the first year of the war, if you asked Ukrainians, are you willing to trade land for peace? The vast majority, I don't know what it was, 95, 98% said not a chance. The latest polls are saying maybe 50-50 now. So there's a recognition that there are some realities on the ground, which is kind of what Secretary of Defense Hegseth said the other day, that we've got to kind of separate ourselves from what we want to the cards we actually have to play now. So that doesn't sound particularly I'd like to end on a much more optimistic and upbeat note, but I think that is true, that Ukrainians have very mixed views on this. And, they've been frustrated for the last several years on the lack of clarity from the leader of the free world, the United States. Now they've got clarity. What do we do with it?
Well, and from what I'm hearing and the folks that I speak to, there's also a sense this isn't a surprise. If you look at Ukraine's history, not going back even 91, but you go back, 100 years, 150 years, every time they have tried to get independence from Moscow, they've been kind of betrayed, let down, abandoned, because the concept of getting a direct confrontation with Russia is very daunting, shall we say. So the Ukrainians I speak to are not surprised. Some are disappointed. Some are, fearful. I get your point. I've also spoken to many who, feel that let's just stop the chaos, stop the war, and, we'll figure it out down the road. I don't know. I don't know. I share some of those concerns that I hear from Ukrainians. And also one last point before I'll let you close out for us, but is that I also hear from certain sectors that the Americans don't understand the threat. The Westerners don't understand the threat, and that if you let them get away with a benefit, and they being the Kremlin and Moscow, that all they'll do is come back later. That's certainly what I heard on Maidan in 2014, and it's the concerns I hear now today with if this isn't concluded with a just, sustainable peace, just accepting any peace will only, prompt another war in 5-10 years. You know, who knows? And maybe that'll be a bigger war that will suck in, Europe. And what will Europe be if it breaks with the United States? All these things. But the point is that I'm hearing from Ukrainians that, yes, we want, I've heard lots of things as you have, but I still do hear you don't get it. If they get success, if they get things they want, which of course is counter to a negotiation, but regardless, I've heard this repeatedly throughout the war. If we don't get a definitive peace, that it'll happen again later.
100%. And those who understand that best are, no surprise, those that border Russia. The Finns understand quite well what the consequences of failure in Ukraine are, as do the Balts, as do the Poles. But the further west you go, whether it's Germans or the French or the Americans, the more diluted that message seems to become.
And if you have an entire ocean between you.
Well, as Trump has pointed out, we're safe behind our ocean. I'm not so sure that's true.
I don't think that's true at all.
But it is, if we fail Ukraine, I think it's a failure on so many levels. It's a failure to people who deserve much better and who put their faith in us. It's also just a failure of morality. I've been bouncing around, as you have, to war zones for decades. And most wars that I've been witness to were messy, ambiguous affairs. It was hard to find the good guys. There were a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, it was shades of gray. Ukraine's not like that. And that's one of the reasons I got this tattoo. To kind of remind me. It was a way of reminding myself that there was still a just cause out there. And if we fail that just cause, it'll sadden the Ukrainians. It'll sadden a lot of us.
And it'll be a betrayal, in my opinion. A straight up betrayal. Yeah. So, that's why we do this show. And please do click the subscribe and all those good things, the alarm bell. I guess I'll just finish it off here with perhaps the best thing that we can do, and that is to push back against, in particular, Putin and the Kremlin's disinformation campaign, but the disinformation campaign that exists all around the world, and we find within the kind of MAGA movement. How do what messaging do you think we can get to my audience here, and let's hope we grow it and get it spread as far and wide as we can to push back on this, because they're, in my opinion, winning the disinformation war, and it's part of that we see the attack on American, institutions. So how do we? What can we say as we end up to our audience, the audience who's watching, to get that messaging out?
Well, I think we have to be focused in what we're trying to push back against, because there's this cacophony of misinformation out there. Some of it directed by the Kremlin, no doubt about it. Some of it just directed by a desire for views or clicks or money or influence. Just sort of not immoral per se, but amoral. But on this particular issue, on Ukraine, I think if people knew what was happening, they would support it. I don't think Americans are, stupid people or bad people. I think, on the contrary, we still have a notion in our country that we support the underdog. We want the little guy to have a chance. And this is the little guy. Ukraine is the little guy. Russia is the bully, without any doubt at all. And if we can figure out a way of pushing that narrative that we've got a David and Goliath story going on here. And sure, it's taking time. It's 3 years and we're still in the midst of war. But point out that despite the sort of dire headlines that you may get in U.S. papers or in Western papers that, Russia took another village yesterday and so on, The thrust of the war is not in Russia's favor.
No.
Russia's economy is contracting. Its interest rates are expanding. It's finding fewer and fewer countries willing to buy its oil. Ukraine is beefing up its local defense industries. It's attacking Russia on a daily basis. It's protected its cities in many ways from missile and drone attacks. It's holding the line in a vast number of places along the front. That this is by no means a lost cause. In fact, this war could be won by Ukraine if we throw a bit of weight behind it. I think that would resonate with people. But yeah, we've got to get that message out there.
Well, they struggle to take little towns out in the east, and they spend months doing it at great expense to themselves, and they haven't even reached major cities like Kramatorsk or Kharkiv and, God forbid, Odessa or Kiev. I don't think it's within their capacity to do that, and we need to. My impression is we need to push that messaging forward. That they just don't have it in them to take the things that they really need to take, unless we surrender, unless we give it to them and acquiesce.
That's right.
But very, very last question, same kind of question, but not about Ukraine. How do we fight against the disinformation campaign regarding American soft power and things like USAID and aid to on a global stage?
That's a tough
one. How do we get
that
that message to Americans that it's something we need to do? Americans are very insular. They think the oceans, as we've already mentioned, will save them always. That's not the case anymore, I don't believe. But how do we convince Americans that soft power is something we still need to engage in?
Yeah, I think it comes back to an even bigger question, which is how do we convince Americans that we need to be sort of the critical country in world affairs. We can't simply step back. We can't throw up walls. We can't build fences. We can't pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist. We live in a globalized economy. We live in a place where diseases cross borders. We live in a place where somebody could smuggle a dirty bomb in a suitcase into Omaha, Nebraska. We cannot insulate ourselves. So given that, we need to expand our influence. And I don't mean this in an imperialistic way, but we need to get out the message that, what America stood for in the First World War, in the Second World War. We can still stand for that. But I don't know how you do it in the current media environment. And, you would have deeper thoughts on this than I. But I mean, these kinds of messages are being made in mainstream newspapers. Even in the Wall Street Journal, a relatively conservative paper. There was an editorial today about how what Trump is pushing is not peace through strength; it's through weakness.
It's through withdrawal.
Exactly.
It's pulling back.
Exactly. But, how many people pick up the Wall Street Journal or the Economist or the Washington Post, or the New York Times or the Financial Times, whatever? Very few. And so if you're getting your news from TikTok or Facebook or Twitter or something, good luck.
Yeah, I mean, I look at just as a closing note, and Chris, thank you very much for coming by and speaking to us, and I hope it finds open ears.
Thank
you. But I think that one thing we also need to stress, and that's one of the reasons why we created the show and why we speak to the audience about these topics, is that the oceans aren't going to save us from the disinformation campaign and the psychological warfare that is being conducted against us in the United States. And if you feel that you've been uneasy and not on stable ground, that is in some part, and I don't want to overstate it, but in some part due to the Kremlin. So that's why we're here, and we'll spread your information. Hopefully we'll get some support for your group. It's a shame that we have to do it privately instead of governmentally, but it is what it is, and we'll keep fighting, right?
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for what you're doing. This is important, and thanks for having me on.
All right, Chris. Thank you very much. Cheers.